you, Shivani. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. And thanks, everybody, for taking out the time to join us today. So I hope you're able to see my screen. Could you just say yes in the chat if you can? Okay, great. So as we are aware, we are going to be looking at bringing group discussions to life in the language classroom today. And to start us off, we have these 3 comments or statements made by teachers of English about their experiences of using group discussions in class. So I would like you to have a quick read of these statements or comments. And could you share which of these statements do you identify with? So you can see that the statements are numbered. You could just share the numbers in the chat, and you can pick more than one. You can pick all 3 if all of them resonate with you. All right, so we have a range of responses here, and I'm happy to see that many of you pointed out that more than one of these statements resonate with you, and that's great news, because this is exactly what we are going to be focusing on. We are going to be looking at maximizing student participation, identifying areas that can be focused on in a discussion, and dealing with dominant or stronger learners during discussions. So let's begin with the first one, which is actually the most crucial thing that we'll be looking at today. It will be the most important part of our session today, maximizing student participation. Now, when I started off as a teacher of English, I would use group discussions very often in my classes, and I would try and think of interesting topics, topics that my learners might enjoy talking about. And I would set up the activities nicely, giving clear instructions and everything. But many a time I would notice that only a few learners were actually participating, and the rest of them were either clueless, or they were just waiting for the discussion to be over. And that would break my heart in a way, because I wouldn't really have the answer as to why they are not participating, why all of them are not participating, and there are just a few who are participating. I did get the answer to that question a few years later, with more teaching experience and with a lot of reading up that I did. And I put everything together and came up with this TOPS approach. This is what I call the TOPS approach. There are 4 elements to that. And I feel that if we take care of these 4 components, we are more likely to engage everybody in discussions in the classroom. So we are going to look at all 4 of them. I'm sure you've already guessed what the first one is, because we have kind of spoken about that already. It's the topics. So obviously we try and choose topics which our learners might enjoy talking about. So things like their age, their needs, their professions, all those things kind of tell us or kind of indicate what topics might be interesting for them. So that's something we think about all the time. And when I was new, this is the only thing I used to think about while setting up a group discussion. But then there are 3 more elements that we need to bear in mind while setting up a group discussion. So before I kind of share with you what these other elements are, why don't you have a go at it? Why don't you try and guess what these 3 things might be? So please share your thoughts in the chat. What might O, P, and S indicate? So somebody says O could be for opinions, objectives. Okay, interesting. What about P? What might P be? People, participation, press. Somebody says personalize. Okay, nice. How about S? What do you think S could be? Skills, socializing, scaffolding, interesting. Okay, great. We've got a lot of responses here. Now, let me quickly share with you what these three things are. So we'll be talking about them briefly right now, and then after a bit, we'll be talking about each of these elements in more detail with examples. So O is actually the outcome. So somebody did mention objectives, that was quite close. So we're talking about the outcome here. Now, what we really need to remember is that a discussion is a means to an end. It's never an end in itself. So if there's no outcome, then there is no real reason for learners to speak. There's no real motivation to speak. So the outcome, I would say, is the most crucial thing when setting up a group discussion, because it gives our learners a reason to speak, a need to speak. And just reaching the conclusion cannot really be an outcome. That's not a very realistic outcome. So we will be looking at a few examples of realistic outcomes in a bit. But yes, an outcome, having an outcome in place is really important when it comes to setting up a group discussion. The second, the third element is personalization. So we all know that everybody loves talking about themselves. Their favorite topic is themselves. So, and as teachers of English, we always try to tap into that. We always try to exploit that by personalizing everything we do in class. And the same applies with group discussions. The more personalized the discussion, the more likely are learners to contribute to it. Because when the discussion is personalized, learners can actually draw on their own experiences and kind of contribute like that. So it really helps them contribute. It really helps them to add something to the discussion. And it's obviously more interesting for them to talk about. So personalization is another thing which really helps. And the last thing that we have here is support. So somebody did mention scaffolding, so very close to what I have here. So when I say support here, I'm not just talking about linguistic support. Yes, some learners are not able to contribute because of linguistic barriers, but those are not the only barriers that are there. Sometimes there could be something like a gap in their knowledge. So if there's a gap in the world, if there's a gap in their world knowledge, that needs to be plugged in first. Because if they don't know much about the topic, they obviously won't be able to say much. Also, sometimes learners might know about the topic, but they are not able to think of ideas very quickly. They are not able to generate a lot of ideas, which could limit their participation and contribution. So again, we could try and help them with idea generation, and we'll be looking at all these things in more detail, that how we could support them or how we could supplement what they know. So let's look at each of these elements in more detail with more examples to make it clear. So the first one is, so here we have an example of a group discussion activity. Why don't you have a quick read? So as we can see here, learners have been given a list of crimes, and they are required to decide on punishments for each crime. Now, what's missing here? Well, there are a lot of things missing actually, but the most important thing that's missing here is the outcome. Now, some of you might argue that there is an outcome because they need to decide on the punishments for each of these crimes. So I would agree, yes, there is an outcome here, but it's not very realistic. It's not very lifelike. Because in real life, we don't really, not all of us get to do such things. So it may not be very interesting for learners, and it may not be very realistic for them to just decide on punishments like that. Now, if we turn around the same activity and make it something like this, where we are putting them in a situation. So I would give you a few seconds to have a read. So they're put in a situation here, and they have been entrusted with the responsibility of making these two decisions. And in order to supplement this, we could give them profiles of four different prisoners, sorry. So they look at the profiles of these prisoners, they analyze it, they use their higher order thinking skills, and then they kind of have a discussion about this with their group members, and then they try to reach a consensus as to who should be released. So this is more likely to engage them because they need to be able to decide on these things by the end of the discussion, and you know, they also have been given some kind of an authority here, so which will actually pique their interest in the discussion itself. So that's the power of adding a realistic outcome. Like I said, if there's no outcome, there's no real motivation to speak. So some of our learners are so intrinsically motivated that they will speak no matter what. And it's great to have such learners in our classes, but not everybody is like that. Sometimes it's important for us to provide that extrinsic motivation, and an outcome can really help with that. So there's more motivation and the participation will be higher. In the absence of an outcome, the participation could be very low or even nil for some learners. Let's look at another example. So we have another discussion activity here. The topic is fairly interesting. It's about food, which everybody likes. And I'll give you a few seconds to have a look at the activity. So as we can see here, learners are required to rank these 7 things in order of their importance when choosing out where to go out to eat. So here there is an outcome for sure, and it's more realistic and more lifelike as compared to the previous one, but it's still not very personalized. So it, you know, that element of personalization is a bit missing here. So again, how can we turn around the same activity into a different activity where it's more personalized and there is a more realistic outcome? Here is an example. So now, rather than randomly discussing which things are more important when deciding where to go out to eat, the learners have been asked to choose a place for themselves. So again, more personalization here because they need to decide where they should be going out to eat after class. So a lot of personalization. And also, each learner, each group member has been given a situation here, which is unique. You know, each learner has a unique situation here. So this really helps because, you know, all the situations are very relatable and very realistic. So they can actually, like I talked about earlier, they can actually draw on their personal experiences to add to the discussion. Also, because each learner has been given a different role, it makes it, you know, more or less necessary for them to participate because each learner knows, each group member knows that they are bringing something unique to the table. So they will be more motivated to speak and, you know, present their side of the story. So this can really help engage even the quieter or the more shy learners in the discussion. Let's look at one more example. So this is in fact one of the activities I used very early on in my teaching career. I used it with an upper intermediate class. And I have no qualms in admitting that the activity fell absolutely flat. Just 4 or 5 learners out of 12 or 14 learners actually participated in the discussion. So I'll give you a few seconds to go over it. So here we have a clear outcome, a very realistic outcome. We need to decide whose picture deserves to go on the British Council Wall of Fame. And there's a bit of personalization happening here because they are deciding whose picture goes up on the British Council Wall of Fame, so their own institute's Wall of Fame. So a bit of personalization is there. There is an outcome. Then why do you think the discussion failed so miserably? What was missing? Absolutely. The support was missing, and a lot of people have already pointed that out. What if our learners don't know enough about these personalities? If they don't know enough, they obviously can't participate. So, apart from language barrier, here there is another barrier which has been added, which is a knowledge barrier. So that was missing. Many of my learners didn't know about those personalities enough to be able to contribute to that discussion. So how could we offer them support here? We could give them a short write-up about each of the personalities before the discussion so that they could have a quick read. They have now got a better understanding of what these personalities have done. And then in the actual discussion, they will have much more to participate, much more to contribute. And, if you've planned ahead, you don't really have to do the work yourself. You could do this as a flipped task as well. So if you know you're going to be holding that discussion on a given day, you could ask them to look up these personalities in their own time. It could be a homework task of sorts. So they look up, and you could, to make it easier for them, you could divide them into groups, and each group could be given one personality to look up. They kind of find out about that personality and come to class, and then you regroup them so that they all tell each other about the personality they found out things about. So it could be an information gap kind of a thing. And after everybody knows about all the personalities, we could actually hold that discussion where they each, kind of fight for a particular personality, and they try to justify why their picture deserves to go on the Wall of Fame. So we are actually, helping them plug gaps in their knowledge, which will really empower them, and they'll be in a much better position to participate in the discussion after that. So this is about offering support in terms of knowledge. The other kind of support that we could provide our learners would be in terms of idea generation. So we've already looked at this activity earlier, but then for an activity like this, how can we support our learners with idea generation? Now, before the actual discussion starts, where they try to decide where to go out to eat, learners with the same role could be grouped together. So all ones together, twos together, threes together, and fours together. And they are just given some time to brainstorm ideas. So they're just discussing, they're just brainstorming what all they could say in the actual discussion, which will help them kind of convince their group members where to go. So for example, all ones will brainstorm ideas as to what they could say to their group members to convince them to go for a cheaper restaurant. So this kind of scaffolding can really help, because some learners we know are very quick in terms of, they can really think on their feet, but not everybody can. So learners who are quick in terms of thinking will be able to then support other learners who may not be able to think of ideas so quickly. And all this takes us just 3-4 more minutes. So before the actual discussion, you're quickly grouping them, giving them 3-4 minutes. They quickly brainstorm ideas, share their ideas with each other, and then you group them again. And then they have that actual discussion. So rather than the teacher offering support, learners are supporting each other. So in that way, we are really able to support them with idea generation. Now, after listening to ideas of other ones, each one in the group will know what exactly to say in the actual group discussion. So they'll be much more confident and they'll have much more to bring to the table because they've had support from their peers. So those were the 4 elements: coming up with interesting topics, establishing a realistic outcome, personalizing the activity to whatever degree possible, and thinking what kind of support learners might need in terms of knowledge, in terms of idea generation, and of course in terms of language as well. As teachers of English, we always think about offering more and more linguistic support in terms of functional language and all of that. That's always there. So that was about maximizing participation from students. Now the next part is going to be choosing areas to focus on. Now, another problem that teachers sometimes face with group discussions is that sometimes, learners, after doing one group discussion after the other, I mean, if you're doing too many group discussions in class, learners might sometimes start questioning that what are we learning? What are we gaining out of it? All we do is just come and speak. So the learning that's happening may not be very tangible in many cases. Now, it goes without saying that a group discussion is an excellent fluency building activity, but that's not all it is. Even in a group discussion, even in an activity like group discussion, we could make learning very tangible for our learners if we choose to focus on something specific. So let's look at a few things we could focus on in a group discussion. So here are some very commonly focused things. Now, I'm sure all of us have used these things. We have focused on these things in group discussions: language for expressing opinions, asking for opinions. So this kind of functional language is very commonly focused on in a group discussion. But these are not the only areas to focus on. We can focus on so much more. We can cover so many other language areas. So let's put our heads together and try to think of some other areas that could be focused on in a group discussion. Would you share some of your ideas in the chat, please? Somebody says making suggestions. Brilliant. Language for interruption. Great. Describing. Language for negotiating. Absolutely. Giving examples. Some really interesting ideas coming in. Clarification, giving solutions, some really good ideas there. Now, let me share with you a few things I have here. This is by no means a comprehensive list, but I've just tried to put a few things together that we could focus on in a group discussion. Have a look. And we have a few more here. So there's so much that we could do in a group discussion, so much that we could choose to focus on. And I quite like this lexical bit. This is something we often ignore in group discussion. So very often course books are based on themes. So a particular unit is based on a particular theme, for example, crime. So having a group discussion at the end of that unit, if you've had 4 or 5 lessons on a particular theme, having a group discussion at the end could be an excellent way of closing that unit, wherein we're giving our learners an opportunity to use the vocabulary they might have picked up in that unit, because they must have done some sort of reading, listening, they must have been exposed to a lot of topical vocabulary there. So having a group discussion at the end will give them an opportunity to actually use that vocabulary in a realistic context where they're expressing their views on something. So that can really help. But then for this to be successful, learners need to be reminded that they have looked at some useful vocabulary related to the topic. They should be given some time to actually collate all that vocabulary in one place, to make it easier for them to be able to use that vocabulary in the discussion. So, what I generally do in my classes is I give them time to come up with a word cloud kind of a thing. So they kind of jot down all the new vocabulary they might have picked up related to the particular theme. They put it in one place. And then at the time of a discussion, they'll be more mindful of using this vocabulary. You could even have cut-ups of this vocabulary at each table. So when a particular group is discussing a topic, all the new words, which they picked up in that unit could be placed on the table. And then when somebody manages to use that word, they pick up the word. So, they are more motivated to kind of use that vocabulary, and then they pick it up. And at the end, they could even, count the number of words they managed to pick up, which will also bring in a competitive element there. So they'll be more motivated to use them. Now, some of you might be thinking now that how do we decide what to focus on? There's so much that we could focus on, but how do we decide? So I would say 2 things can really help us here. The first thing would be the learner's level, of course. So basis the level of your learners, you could decide which particular area, which particular language area you could focus on. For example, if I go back to this list, if I'm dealing with higher levels, I might focus on something like adding emphasis or sounding tentative. And if I'm dealing with a pre-int class or an int class, I might focus on something like repair strategies, which would be more useful for them. So learners' level could really help us choose which areas to focus on. The other thing would be the activity itself. So the activity itself can tell us a lot about what our focus should be. So a useful thing to do would be doing the activity yourself. So, you could do the activity with 1 or 2 colleagues to see what kind of language is naturally coming up in the activity, in the discussion. Because whatever is naturally going to come up, it makes more sense to focus on that. So if you're doing a particular activity and you can identify that there will be a lot of comparison happening in the activity, it will be worth your while to focus on language for comparing before the group discussion. And that will really help our learners as well. Also, because they have looked at a particular language area and they are trying to use it in the discussion, learning will be more tangible for them. So let's look at an example here. Let's say you want to do this activity with your learners. So have a quick read, please. Now let's say you're doing this activity in an intermediate class. So what areas do you think you would choose to focus on before the discussion? Could you share some of your ideas in the chat? Making suggestions, somebody says conditionals, agreeing, disagreeing, future plans. Okay, really good ideas there. So here's what I thought about, a few things we could focus on for this type of an activity. So we do have conditionals here. Now, something like language for contrasting, language for comparing, this is something we do all the time in our day-to-day life. So if we focus on something like this by way of a discussion, it's going to prove really useful for learners, and they'll be able to start using it outside of class right after the discussion. So they can really see the progress very easily there. So a lot of things can be focused on, and the guiding questions here would be what level are my learners at, and what are the demands of the activity, what kind of language will naturally and organically come up in that discussion, and we could then focus on that kind of language before the discussion. Of course, we can't really be focusing on too many things at the same time. So a good rule of thumb would be focusing on one or maximum two things, not more than that. Otherwise, there'll be a lot of cognitive overload there. I mean, they'll have a lot to think about, which will again restrict their participation in the actual discussion. So there shouldn't be too much burden on them. So that was about areas we could focus on, in a group discussion. Now, moving on to the last bit, the last element of today's session, dealing with stronger or dominating learners. So I'm sure we all can relate to this. In our classes, we always have those highly motivated, very chatty learners. They may not be necessarily at a higher level in terms of their language proficiency, but they are more motivated to speak. They're more fluent in general. So we all have those learners in our class. And here I've indicated those learners with these triangles. Now, it's really good to have such learners in our class. We all want them, we like them. But the only problem is that these learners sometimes tend to hijack the discussion. If they are, having a discussion with other people, they may not realize sometimes that they are not giving others enough opportunities to speak. So that can be a problem. That can be really demotivating for the less confident or the reticent learners that we might have in our class. So this is something we really need to address, to be able to give all of our learners a level playing field where all of them feel confident in participating. So how do we do this then? How do we deal with these learners? So the first step is obviously to identify who these learners are. We need to know for sure which of our learners generally tend to speak a lot, and they kind of eat into other students' speaking time as well. So we identify them first, and then we can do multiple things to kind of balance it out. The first thing we could do is establishing routines using props. So I have a few examples of props we can use here on the screen. What we could do is we could give each group one prop. And the rules would be that only the person holding the prop is allowed to speak. And the other rule that you need to establish is that you can't hold the prop for more than 30 or 40 seconds. So when they know that they can speak only when they have the prop and they can't really hold the prop for more than 40 seconds, it will automatically balance the participation from all learners, because they will know on their own that they are supposed to hand it over to somebody else, which will then give them a chance to speak. So this kind of a routine can really help. And the prompts don't have to be fancy at all. I mean, these prompts look a little young learnerish, if I may say so, but I've used it with adults and they work just as well. But like I said, the prompts don't have to be fancy at all. You could use something as simple as a marker or a duster. It's just that having something tangible in place really reminds them that they are not supposed to speak for more than 30 or 40 seconds, and they're supposed to hand it over to somebody else. So it's a quick reminder there. So that can be one way of balancing the participation in class. The other way could be assigning them a task. So if we know for a fact that 4 of our learners are generally more dominating in a discussion, we could assign them a special task or an extra task. You could tell them before the discussion that you are going to lead the discussion, for example, and you're supposed to make sure that everybody gets a chance to participate. So now, rather than you monitoring what these people are doing, they'll be monitoring themselves on their own, because they would know that it is our responsibility to ensure that everybody gets a chance to speak. So they'll be much more considerate about how much are others getting to speak. So it'll make our lives much simpler as teachers, because we don't really have to go about reminding them over and over again. So assigning a task can really help, and they feel special about it. When you tell them that you are going to be leading the discussion or you're going to have an extra task up your sleeve, it actually motivates them. They feel even more confident that they've been assigned that task. So it works for both our stronger learners and the shy learners who are shy as well, because they are now getting more opportunities to speak. So that can work too. And the third strategy that we could use is regrouping our learners in such a way that all the stronger learners end up in one group. Now, this can be another fun way to deal with stronger learners, because we are helping the stronger learners feel more challenged, because they are with other chatty learners. Now they'll have to fight it out. They'll really have to, earn that turn. So we are challenging them more, and which will actually engage them more in the discussion because they feel more challenged. And at the same time, we are doing some service to our underconfident or shy learners as well, because they will have more time and space to think what they want to say. They'll have, they'll be able to express themselves more confidently, because they are now speaking without the fear of being cut off mid-sentence. So this will gradually build up their confidence as well, that yes, we can express what we want to say confidently. And over a period of time, when they have kind of built that kind of a confidence, we could actually regroup them in such a way where each group has that highly motivated or chatty learner, so that the underconfident learners get to test how confident are they now. Are they really able to hold the ground and say what they want to say, even if they have a chatty learner in the group? So we can keep doing that to test how much confidence they've managed to build over a period of time. So, when it comes to dealing with such stronger learners, I believe that we should be using a mix of these strategies, because if we use the same strategy over and over again, it becomes very repetitive. It becomes very evident what we are trying to do. So if we use a mix of everything, it really helps us balance out the participation. It helps us to maintain that conducive environment in the class, and they don't really get to know what's going on. So it can really help. I've tried all 3 of them and they work really well. most of the times. So using a mix of these strategies can really help. So that's all really from my end. I'll ask Alan to help us out with the Q&A.
Hello, yes, thank you very much for a fantastic, very comprehensive overview of encouraging learners to speak in groups. I thought you covered a lot of ground there in a very short time. And it seemed to me that one of the things that was really important was that preparation is key. What you do before the lesson is almost as, or is more important than what actually happens within the lesson. And there was one question actually that related to that in the chat box, which was, you know, are there sort of strategies that you can use to cut down on preparation time, or is it always the fact that you need to put in a lot of preparation to set up an effective speaking lesson, speaking activity?
Yes, I do agree that a lot of preparation can go into, you know, preparing for a nice discussion activity. So one thing is that over a period of time, that preparation time will go down. Like for me, like when I started out, it used to take a lot of time to prepare for such activities, but over a period of time, I was able to think more quickly and the preparation time went down. Also, we don't really always have to reinvent the wheel. There are some really good resources available which with really interesting ideas. Like I did use an activity from a Pennier's book. It's called Discussions That Work. So there are some brilliant discussion ideas over there. And there are other similar resources on the internet where, you know, we have ready-made activities available. So if we are doing a particular theme, we are covering a particular topic, we could just pick one of the activities related to that topic. So that can considerably reduce the preparation time. But even if we are adapting activities on our own, initially, yes, it might take some time, it may take a while, but then after a few time, I mean, after you've done it for a few times, the preparation time goes down considerably. So it might seem like a lot to begin with, but believe you me, it'll get much better with time.
Okay, that's great. That's really useful to also have some resources as suggestions for consulting. And yeah, I've used the Discussions That Work by Pennier. That's great. So in an ideal situation, what do you think the ideal number should be to make up a group?
Again, depending on the activity and how you set it up, it might vary, but I generally try to keep groups small so that everybody gets a chance to participate. So something like 3s or 4s would sometimes work. Sometimes, you know, if you have a really big class, you could have bigger groups as well. For example, 6 people in one group. But then what I try and do is I ask 3 of them to actually participate in the discussion and 3 of them are just observing so that they could give them some feedback at the end. So in that way, you know, all of them are engaged and they are getting some feedback. So rather than having just one group discussion, we could have 2 different group discussions. In the first group discussion, let's say A, C, and E participate and B, D, and F simply observe and share feedback, and then we swap their roles. So this way we can operate with bigger groups, and but the pattern and the format will be a little different.
Yeah, that's a really good idea, because that gets them also to start thinking about the mechanics of speaking and getting them to analyze what's going on with speaking, and asking them to give feedback can be really important. Yeah, really helpful for the person giving feedback as well as those receiving it. So a question from Amir here is, do you have any suggestions to help students improve their fluency in particular. So when you've got students who are struggling with accuracy, with fluency, what can you do to help them become more fluent?
So there are many things we could do. So for example, doing a lot of extempore in class where they're given a topic, they think about it, and they're supposed to speak on the topic at length. So we could do some of it in class. We could also help them with different topics that they could try out at home. That can be one thing. Also, what I suggest my learners is that, you know, they could do a kind of a conversation with themselves. So whatever they're thinking. So generally we tend to think in our first language. That's something that generally happens with people. So what I ask them to do is that whatever thoughts are coming to you, try and translate them into English. So whatever comes to mind, just ask yourself, how would I say this in English? So in a way, they are kind of training their brain to start thinking in English at some point. And they obviously can't be doing this all day. So, you know, they could start with 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day, and go up gradually to maybe half an hour every day. So in that way, even if they don't have anybody to practice with, they're still able to work on their fluency and their ability to think in English faster. So that's something I tell my learners to do.
Okay, thank you. And if we take this onto an online environment rather than a face-to-face activity, you talked about the idea of using props to control the amount of time that learners speak. Do you have any suggestions for how to translate that to an online environment? Is there any way that that can be done online?
It might be a little more challenging to do that online, but we could definitely try to replicate. So, for example, we could I mean, as the teacher, we could ask them to come up with a prop with them. So it could be as something as simple as a ball or a pen or something. And then when they're having that discussion, provided they all have their cameras on, that is, they could just do the action of handing it over. So all of them would not have the same prop in that way, but still, you know, they have something tangible that they're handing over to somebody else. So that might work. Or raise hand could work. So whoever has their hand raised is the one speaking. And after 30, and nobody can have their hand raised for more than 30 seconds. So after they've spoken for 30 seconds, they lower their hand and then somebody else raises their hand and speaks. It may not be as interesting as a face-to-face setup, but yeah, props could work. If they all have props in their proximity, they could just, do the action of handing it over to somebody else.
That's a really nice idea. I like that. I hadn't thought of that. That's great. Alexander McEwen has got a suggestion or question. I'm not sure. It's a mix of the two. He says, have you ever used sentence stem cards that students can pick up and use in the discussion?
Absolutely, because especially when we focus on functional language in a discussion, this is again a problem I have faced a lot in my classes. Students will understand the functional language, we'll drill it, and they'll be very comfortable. But when it comes to the actual discussion, they forget using those expressions. So if we give them something like this, if we give them a tangible reminder that this needs to be used in the discussion, they are more likely to be able to use it. So there's a very good resource that I came across in Scott Thornbury's book. It's called Teaching Speaking, if I'm not wrong, that's what it's called, Teaching Speaking. It's How to Teach Speaking. And he talks about something called discussion bingo in that. So, we make bingo tickets there, and we can make it very easily online. There's something called bingo ticket generator. If you just type bingo ticket generator, you just need to paste those expressions there, and then you are able to get these ready-made bingo tickets. So what you do is you give each learner a bingo ticket, which has some of the expressions that they have looked at before the discussion, some of the sentence stems they've looked at. And then during the discussion, if they're able to use that expression, they just cross it out. And then whoever is able to cross out all the expression wins. So, that's again gamifying it a bit. And it does really get them thinking more about the expression. So sentence stems could also work like that.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah. There's a question from Ingeborg Nanig, who says, is there an ideal or recommended period of time that a group discussion should take? So what are the factors that you need to take into account when you're assigning how much time to a group discussion when you're planning, for example?
So first of all, the outcome will help us decide if they are deciding on multiple things. If they have a lot of ground to cover, then of course they will need the time to be able to do that. Also, the number of participants. If there are more participants, the discussion is likely to go on for a longer period of time, as opposed to a group having just 2-3 members. The discussion will die down in a few minutes. Also, when I'm monitoring the discussion happening in the class, I like to see if they're actually on it, or if the discussion has started to kind of die down a little. So what I also do is sometimes, when I feel they don't have much to add, I become the devil's advocate and I tell them, but what if, and I give them a thought there, and then that could ignite the discussion again. So, but then to answer the question, generally I try to give them about 8 to 10 minutes for a discussion, again depending on what kinds of things they need to decide on and how many people are there. But on an average, I think 8 to 10 minutes is generally enough.
I think it also depends on how used the group are to discussing. You might want to start with a very short time. If you're just introducing this kind of activity into the class, then making it manageable by making it just a short, quick discussion can help, and then building up to longer time as you progress.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, actually. The stage of the lesson that we are at, for example, if it's a warmer, then it might be a very short discussion. And if it's a speaking activity at the end, it might be longer because they'll have a lot to do there. So, yeah.
There's a lot to consider in this, isn't there? Another question, this is from Fernando, and he asks, if you are dealing with a taboo subject and the discussion gets heated, which sometimes happens, and this can lead to conflict between students, what can you do?
So first of all, I mean, we always try and avoid such topics, but then things are changing, we are evolving as teachers, and now some people also feel that these topics should be discussed in classes, because it's a safe environment to discuss such topics, and there will be differences of opinion, and students need to learn how to deal with that as well. So I think some sort of signposting can help, that yes, we all are entitled to our own opinions, and it's okay if you don't agree with someone. So some kind of signposting at the beginning could help minimize those kinds of conflicts. But if they do arise, I think we could simply pitch in there and just help them understand that it's absolutely fine. Even in a in a real world situation, this might happen, but then we could tell them how to politely disagree with somebody, or some sort of input there, just exploiting that moment and making it into a teachable moment might help. But yeah, we have to be able to foresee such things and prepare for that in advance.
Yeah, that's really great. Are there any tips you have? This is from Belal Al-Hubaishi. Are there any tips for organizing successful group discussions when you have large classes? So, that might be a bit more difficult to manage in terms of, is everyone on task, and also noise levels, things like that. Are there any specific tips you've got for teaching group discussions with large classes?
So like earlier, I shared that idea that if it's a particularly large group, then, rather than having all of them discuss at the same time, some of them could be made observers and some of them might actually discuss. So that could help us sort of monitor the noise levels as well. And we could actually listen to people who are discussing. So we could do that. So let's say it's the class has 30 learners. So 15 of them are participating in the discussion and 15 are just observing. Of course, they'll be in different groups, and we also assign a buddy. So for example, everybody knows who they are observing. So they're observing a particular person in that discussion and they're sharing feedback with that person. So that can really help us. So, but obviously, rather than having one discussion, then we'll have two discussions. So we'll have to time it like that. But that could really help us manage the discussion better. Also, we could have debates where, we could actually have bigger groups. But again, balancing the participation becomes a problem because the shy learners and the slightly underconfident learners may not really get much opportunities to speak if it's a really big group. So that's something we need to think about.
And I'm just going to ask one last quick question, although there are still lots of questions that I'm afraid we haven't got round to. Your talk has obviously sparked a lot of interest and a lot of questions. What do you think about how to deal with errors in these group discussions? Because you don't want to cut off the discussion, for example. So what would your advice be for teachers in dealing with errors that come up during the discussion?
So initially, when I started off, I used to do a lot of delayed error correction. So I would kind of collate the errors they were making and I would just display them on the board after the discussion is over. And we, as a group, as a class, we'll try and correct those errors. And that's really useful and helpful. But I noticed that, learners are sometimes not very happy with that because they want to get personalized feedback. They want to know which mistakes they made. And they really want their teacher to point out those mistakes. But obviously, like you said, if we do hot correction, if we correct them while they are speaking, it will really, hamper their fluency and their confidence. So what I started doing later on was I used to carry those Post-it notes with me, and I would make quick notes. Like if a particular learner made an error, I'll make a note of that there, and I'll kind of correct it for them. Or depending on the level, of course, if it's a high level class, I'll just write the error and I'll let them think about it and correct it on their own. So after the discussion is over, I would, hand over those Post-it notes to them. Now, it might be a challenge to give each learner a Post-it note because obviously if the discussion is just 8 minutes, you can't possibly monitor everybody. So I used to also maintain I used to track which learners did I give feedback today so that I can focus on the others in the next discussion. And I set that expectation with them that I won't be able to give feedback to each one of you, but eventually by the end of the week, all of you will have had some feedback from me. So and they really like it. Some of them actually used to walk up to me and thank me after the class for giving them personalized feedback.
Oh, that's brilliant. The great ideas here. Shivani, the time is over. We've come to the end of the hour and it's been filled with great ideas and great questions. And I think you've done a fantastic job of covering how to run really good group discussions. Thank you so much for coming along. There's been a lot of positive comments in the chat about the ideas that you presented. And thank you everyone for joining us and taking part in this professional development opportunity to learn more about group discussions. Please do take the time to answer the survey that will be sent to you. You've got information about how to download the certificate, and we do use the feedback from the surveys to plan our future sessions and also, to help our speakers get feedback on what they put into presenting to you. So thank you very much. Thank you especially to Shivani for sharing with us her presentation and her ideas.
Thank you.
And enjoy the rest of your days. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.